The winter wind scraped across the Marquion airfield in northern France as Oberfeldwebel Karl Drexler, a 22-year-old Luftwaffe pilot, tightened the wool collar of his leather jacket. Ground crews rolled out a line of Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6S, their yellow nose cones gleaming like fangs under the gray sky. From above, the lineup looked like a spear pointed toward the west. By late 1943, German fighter groups stationed in occupied Europe believed they understood their enemy: slow, lumbering American bombers and their equally clumsy escorts. For months, Luftwaffe pilots laughed at the mention of the newest American fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt. To them, it was a joke, a flying beer barrel. Karl laughed too, though not as loudly as the others. If the Americans kept sending it, something in that fat machine must be working. Across the channel, the atmosphere at RAF Halesworth was entirely different. The airfield roared with the thunder of radial engines as ground crews swarmed around massive silver-skinned P-47s. Lieutenant James "Red" Walker climbed up to his aircraft, the Cornfield Hurricane, its name painted proudly beneath the canopy. Fuel-topped, 850s loaded, his mechanic shouted over the engine noise. James forced a smile even though his stomach churned with nerves. The weight of responsibility felt immense. Every time he strapped into the Thunderbolt, he wasn't just flying a mission, he was defending the bomber crews who counted on him. In the operations hut nearby, 3 new names had been carved into the wooden memorial board. 3 men lost this week alone. In a briefing room in France, Karl sat with dozens of German pilots as Hauptmann Meyer slammed a pointer against a map of Europe. "The Americans are sending another bomber stream," he barked. "They think we are weakening." Laughter rippled through the room, but it faded when the silhouette of the P-47 Thunderbolt filled the wall. Heavier, faster diving, and brutally armed. "Do not underestimate its firepower," Meyer warned. "But remember, she's heavy. Burns fuel like a leaking tank. Use your climb advantage." Pilots smirked, reassured. Yet Karl couldn't shake the feeling in his chest. Soon after, as the canopy closed over James's cockpit, the world changed into the tremble of metal, oxygen mask breaths, engine vibrations, and the hollow silence of anticipation. He tapped a small photograph taped to the dashboard. His sister Annabelle. "I'll be home soon," he whispered. Then the massive radial engine roared to life. For James and every Thunderbolt pilot, the aircraft wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeline. Heavy armor around the cockpit, a rugged radial engine that could take punishment, and 8.50 caliber Brownings that could punch holes through steel. Still, even the P-47 couldn't protect everyone. The bomber crews depended on them completely. As bomber engines growled across the airfield, waist gunner Sam Delaney leaned out the side of his B-17, grinning at the formation of P-47s forming up beside them. "Looks like the big coffee cans again," he yelled to the other gunners. The pilot replied over the intercom, "Let's hope the Luftwaffe doesn't." Soon the sky was alive, Thunderbolts rising in waves, their silhouettes climbing into the cold morning. The bomber formation stretched miles long, a river of silver threading across the clouds. Their destination, Schweinfurt, the heart of German ball-bearing production. A blow the Americans hoped would cripple the German war machine. Far ahead, hidden in high clouds, German fighters began their dive. Karl's oxygen mask hissed as he tightened it, clouds whipping past his canopy. "Falk, 1 to all wings," he radioed calmly. "Target in sight." Below, the bomber formation glittered like a field of silver shields, and behind them, dozens of dark dots. "Thunderbolts." Karl smirked. "Look at them, fat pigs trying to keep up." Laughter crackled through the radios. But as they closed the distance, those dots grew larger. Muscular. Dangerous. Alive. Karl watched the shapes and felt something cold grip his stomach. Then came the flashes, bright, violent bursts. The P-47s opened fire, and rivers of tracer rounds cut through the sky like glowing red spears. In that moment, the jokes died. The Luftwaffe had never seen a fighter quite like this. From a high dive, James rolled into his attack, the G-forces slamming him into his seat as he lined up a German fighter beneath him. Come on," he muttered, squeezing the trigger. The Thunderbolt shook violently as 8 machine guns roared. A Bf 109 burst into black smoke. From the bombers, cheers erupted. Thunderbolt lit him up like a Christmas tree. Sam shouted. But James didn't celebrate. He knew this was the beginning, not the end. Above, Carl rolled desperately to avoid the storm of gunfire. A Thunderbolt shot past him with terrifying speed. Another German fighter ahead of him was shredded, pieces flying off like paper scraps. Carl's breath caught in his throat. This was no flying milk jug. The fight was just beginning. The sky over Europe was about to erupt into chaos. And both sides knew. Only one would come out alive. The first collision of both forces happened so fast that neither side had time to think, only react. James dove his Thunderbolt through the chaos, feeling the crushing G-force pin his spine as he dropped behind a streaking Bf 109. The engine roared like a furious beast as he steadied his aim. Below him, the German fighter flashed past in a blur of gray and yellow. "Come on, line up," he growled through clenched teeth. He squeezed the trigger and felt the entire aircraft shake under the violent recoil of 8 Browning .50 caliber guns. Red and white tracers erupted from his wings in a blinding torrent. His shots tore into the German fighter's fuselage, and a burst of flame erupted as the plane spiraled away trailing smoke. But James barely had a moment to breathe. The radio was a storm of panic and static, shouting, warnings, pleas for help. Sam Delaney, in the waist position of a B-17, just a few hundred yards away, watched the kill with wide eyes. "Thunderbolt lit him up," he shouted. But amusement died instantly as another German fighter came screaming down toward the bombers. 7 o'clock low? He's coming right for us. Sam swung his .50 cal and opened fire, the gun rattling against its mount. His rounds cracked across the sky, but the German pilot jinked upward at the last second, slipping past the bomber's defensive arc. Meanwhile, Carl Drexler's world had turned into pure chaos. He rolled hard right as a line of tracer fire shot past his canopy. He had never seen a Thunderbolt dive so aggressively. The flying barrel was supposed to be clumsy, yet here it was, moving with predatory speed. Carl cursed and tightened his turn, the pressure squeezing his lungs. "These pigs move. Watch your tails," he shouted into the radio, but it was already too late for several of his comrades. A Bf 109 ahead of him lit up under a broadside of American gunfire. Armor plates tore away like tinfoil, and the fighter plunged into the clouds below. Carl felt his chest tighten, not from G-force, but from something colder. Feared that a new wave of German fighters swooped in from above, silhouettes shimmering in the sunlight. James looked up just in time to see them slicing down toward the bomber stream. "They're coming in hot, from the sun," he yelled. "Stay tight with the bombers." He pushed the throttle forward, and the Thunderbolt responded with a deep, guttural roar. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a storm filled with metal and death. A B-17 to James's right suddenly lurched, one engine exploding into a fireball. The bomber spiraled downward, leaving a long trail of smoke. "God," James whispered. "Hang on, boys." On the bomber's intercom, Sam's voice cracked. "They got the Lincoln Belle. They got her." He swallowed hard as the burning bomber corkscrewed out of formation and disappeared into the low cloud layer. No parachutes appeared. Silence replaced the cheers from earlier. Carl rolled inverted, diving again into the fray, feeling the wind scream across his canopy. He spotted a Thunderbolt climbing back toward the bombers, a perfect target. "Drexler attacking," he called out sharply. He opened fire, 20mm cannon rounds flashing past the American fighter. But the Thunderbolt didn't break. Instead, it flipped in a maneuver Carl had never seen from such a heavy aircraft. The American pulled a brutal, high-G turn that should have stalled a fighter that big, yet it held. Carl's eyes widened. Impossible. The two spiraled around each other, twisting between trails of smoke, each pilot straining against gravity and fear. James heard the cannon rounds tearing through the air near him. He glanced back, saw Carl locked on his tail. He slammed his control stick forward and dropped into a steep dive. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently as he passed 450 miles per hour, then 480. Carl followed, but the 109 vibrated dangerously. The Thunderbolt was made for this. James pushed harder. Carl's warning lights blinked red. At this speed, any wrong movement could tear his wings off. He pulled back just before losing control, watching in shock as the P-47 continued downward into the dive untouched. "They can dive like that," Carl muttered, stunned. "How?" James leveled off just above a cloud layer, breathing hard. Lost him, he gasped, drenched in sweat. Thank you, baby, he whispered, patting the dashboard. The Thunderbolt could take punishment and give it back, but the battle was far from over. Above the clouds, the bomber formation was taking a beating. German fighters made coordinated runs, 2 diving from the front, 2 from the sides, and the B-17s responded with a storm of defensive fire. The air vibrated with the deep thud of heavy machine guns. Shell casings rained down like metallic hail. Sam scanned the sky desperately. Where are the escorts? They're bleeding us dry up here. Then he spotted them, thunderbolts streaking upward like steel arrows. They climbed slower than the Germans, but once they were in the fight, they dominated. James surged back toward the bomber stream. Wolf Pack, tighten up. Push them off the forts. The Thunderbolt pilots regrouped and dove together in a coordinated wall of fire. Their 8.50s created a shimmering curtain of lead. Carl, preparing another pass, saw the barrage too late. A fellow German pilot beside him flew straight into the crossfire. His 109 erupted in flames so violently that Carl felt the heat through his canopy as he banked away. Falk, 3 is hit. He's gone. A German voice shouted over the radio. Carl gritted his teeth and pulled back up toward the sun. The fight was becoming unbearable. For every bomber they damaged, 2 Thunderbolts swarmed into the path. He felt his fuel gauge creeping downward, always the enemy of German pilots. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts, with their huge radial engines, stayed longer and hit harder. James moved through the chaos like he'd been born in it. He spotted an FW-190 diving toward the bombers and swung behind it. The German pilot tried to shake him, but the P-47 stayed glued to his tail. James pressed the trigger. His guns roared, illuminating the sky with bright streaking lines. The 190 erupted in a fireball, spinning out of sight. Through the smoke, Carl saw the Thunderbolts kill. The Americans were now dictating the fight. The Jugs, as they called them, refused to break, refused to run low, refused to fall behind. Carl exhaled shakily. This battle is lost, he whispered. His radio was filled with chaotic calls. Pilots missing. Engines failing. Fuel exhausted. One by one, the German fighters were peeling away, not in victory, but in survival. James soared past the last wave of attackers, heart pounding. The sky began clearing. The bomber formation, bloodied, but intact, steadily pushed toward its target. The worst was over for now. He took a deep breath. He wanted to celebrate, but something inside held him back. Too many voices on the radio had gone silent. Too many planes were missing. As Carl finally turned east, heading back toward Germany with barely enough fuel to make it home. He looked once more over his shoulder at the Thunderbolts circling above the bombers. He didn't laugh anymore. Nobody in his squadron laughed about the P-47 after that day. The Americans' flying barrel was a beast, one that could dive faster, hit harder, and survive punishment that would tear a lighter fighter apart. Carl understood now. This war had changed. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the West was slipping, and the Thunderbolt was pushing it over the edge. James guided his Thunderbolt back toward England as the bombers turned for home. His hands trembled as he finally relaxed his grip on the stick. Below, the shattered clouds drifted like ghostly mountains, hiding the wrecks that would never return. War always took something, even when you won. But today, at least, the bombers had made it through, largely because of the Thunderbolts that had refused to let the German fighters near them. Carl landed with almost no fuel left, rolling to a stop in near silence. His ground crew rushed to him, relieved to see him alive. But Carl didn't smile. He sat in the cockpit, staring at his shaking hands. The jokes were over. The Americans had a monster in the sky, and unless Germany found a way to stop it, the skies over Europe would soon belong entirely to them. The days after the battle over Schweinfurt felt heavy on both sides of the war. For James, sleep came in short bursts, broken by flashes of tracer fire and the sight of tumbling bombers falling through clouds like burning angels. Each morning at RAF Halesworth, he walked past the bulletin board outside the operations hut, the carved wooden list of missing pilots growing longer. Some names were fresh, others he had flown beside for months. He touched the latest inscription with a trembling thumb. "Sorry, buddy," he whispered, barely audible. The war was making him older than his years. Inside the briefing room, Colonel Hub Zemke stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. The Wolfpack pilot sat quietly, waiting. There was no bravado today, only exhaustion. Zemke's voice was steady but carried the weight of truth. Gentlemen, the Luftwaffe is bleeding. Yesterday proved that. But make no mistake, they're not finished. They'll throw everything they have left to keep us from the heart of Germany. He paused, scanning the room. Your Thunderbolts kept dozens of bomber crews alive. You did your duty, and you'll do it again. James nodded slowly, though the idea of returning to battle made his stomach twist. The P-47 outside awaited him like a loyal dog, bruised but unbroken. The ground crew had patched bullet holes along its fuselage and replaced several panels. But the engine, that massive Pratt and Whitney beast, still growled with determination whenever it turned over. It felt alive in a way no machine should. Across Europe, Karl Drexler stood on the cracked concrete of his own battered airfield, staring at the row of Messerschmitts that had once formed a proud spear tip of German air power. Now, only half remained. Some were riddled with holes, patched together with desperation rather than confidence. Others were gone forever, twisted wrecks in distant fields and forests. The silence around him was deafening. Karl's commander addressed the surviving pilots with a hollow tone. We lost too many. And the Americans, their Thunderbolts. He paused as if trying to swallow bitterness. They are not what we believed. The men around Karl stood stiffly, eyes sunken with fear they wouldn't dare admit aloud. Most were barely in their 20s. Some had joined the Luftwaffe when it still held the skies. Now, even the veterans prayed before each flight. Over the coming weeks, the air war intensified. James found himself in the sky almost every day, escorting bombers, diving on enemy fighters, strafing supply lines deep inside France. The Thunderbolt had become the hammer of the skies. Its range was extended with new drop tanks. Its firepower remained devastating. And its pilots, hardened by loss, fought with a quiet fury that left the Luftwaffe reeling. Karl encountered Thunderbolts more than he wished. In one brutal engagement near the Dutch border, he watched 3 P-47s tear through his squadron like lightning. One German pilot tried to outclimb a Thunderbolt and vanished in a hail of .50 caliber fire. Another pulled too sharply to escape and stalled, smashing into a field below. Karl's breath shook as he banked away, his 109 barely maintaining enough power to get him home. Every time he returned, the airfield felt emptier. James, meanwhile, tried to keep himself steady by writing letters. Some to his sister, some to the families of fallen pilots. Words he struggled to form, words that felt insufficient. He fought with courage, he'd write, though he hated how often he needed to say it. Every loss felt like a stone added to the backpack he carried through the war. One afternoon, after a long escort mission, James sat on the wing of his Thunderbolt as the sun dipped behind distant hills. The sky blazed orange, and the airfield grew quiet for the first time in hours. A fellow pilot, Lieutenant Morgan, approached with tired eyes. "Think we'll make it through this?" he asked quietly. James looked at the horizon. "We have to." It wasn't confidence. It wasn't bravado. It was a simple necessity. Meanwhile, in Germany, Karl sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at a small medal tucked into his jacket pocket. His father had given it to him when he joined the Luftwaffe, a symbol of honor, courage, duty. But now it felt heavy in his palm, not as a badge of valor, but as a reminder of what war demanded. Men he had laughed with, trained with, flown beside gone. And no amount of skill could change the fact that Germany was losing control of the WWII. Early 1944, whispers spread across both sides of the conflict. The Luftwaffe was breaking. The Americans could feel it. The Germans could feel it even more. And when the U.S. bombers struck deeper into Germany, escorted by walls of P-47s and the newly arriving P-51s, the truth could no longer be denied that on a bitterly cold morning, Karl took off for one of his last major missions. His squadron climbed into a sky already rumbling with distant engines. When they breached the cloud layer, the sight struck Karl like a hammer. An ocean of American bombers stretching to the horizon, guarded by swarms of Thunderbolts and Mustangs. "God help us," Karl muttered. The fight that followed was short and brutal. The Germans broke formation almost immediately under the overwhelming American firepower. Aircraft fell like burning leaves. Carl barely escaped the carnage, his engine coughing as he limped back to base. He landed hard, skidding across the icy runway, the plane's landing gear collapsing under the strain. Carl emerged from the wrecked cockpit shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the realization that the war in the air was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. For James, the turning point came the day he escorted bombers deep into central Germany and encountered only a handful of enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe wasn't launching its mighty formations anymore. It was sending boys, cadets, pilots with barely an hour in a cockpit. The battle felt wrong. It felt tragic. He shot down one fighter easily, a pale blue 109 flown by someone who looked no older than 17. When he returned to base, James sat alone in the hangar, staring at the floor. "It shouldn't be like this," he whispered by the time the war ended. James had flown dozens of missions and survived all of them, a rare miracle. He returned home with a chest full of medals and a heart full of ghosts. Decades later, when he'd speak at reunions or schools, he always said the same thing. "The P-47 didn't make me brave. It just gave me the chance to come home." Carl survived too, though the war left deep scars. Years later, he would confess that the Americans' Thunderbolt changed his understanding of warfare. It taught him humility, respect, and the terrible cost that every nation pays when young men are sent into the sky to kill each other. And so, in the great ledger of history, the P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place. Not because German pilots laughed at it, but because in the end, they learned to fear it and respect the men who flew it. The war in the air was not about machines. It was about courage, sacrifice, and the haunting truth that even the strongest pilots could never escape the weight of what they had seen in the quiet years that followed the war. Men like James and Carl, once enemies, shared the same sentiment in different parts of the world. No one truly wins a war. They just survive it.